Very warm welcome to everyone joining us today at this side event, Innovation as a Force for Good in the Fight Against Climate Change and Malnutrition, which is happening during the 49th Committee on Food Security. My name is Zitouni Uldeda. I'm the Deputy Director in the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at FAO, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this event today. So let me say a few words first to set the scene and explain the purpose of this event. Today we have two crises really that are happening at the same time, climate change and biodiversity loss, and they're both increasingly affecting food security and nutrition. Climate change in particular affects all four dimensions of food security: availability, access, utilization, and stability. And today we have 811 million people who go hungry, and climate change is one of the main drivers for this. We also have around 3 billion people around the world who can't, unfortunately, afford a healthy diet. So the transformation of agri-food system is really imperative if we want to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and the malnutrition challenges. And agricultural innovation has such a key role to play, not just for being a force for good, but it is also a fundamental part of the solution to these challenges. And since we are in the context of CFS, CFS does focus on making a difference in food security and malnutrition. And CFS, in this case, also offers really a great opportunity to step up our efforts in investing in agricultural innovation that helps us deliver climate change and nutrition in the lead up to COP26 on climate change and beyond. So in this event today, the aim is to explore the opportunities to achieve these joint outcomes of climate change and nutrition, to underline the key role of innovation in developing and achieving these outcomes, and to share opportunities and advance efforts between us through the global action agenda for innovation in agriculture. And this is relevant to CFS and COP26, which is happening in about 3 weeks, because the discussions will address the CFS policy recommendations on food security and climate change, the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, and the findings of the 2021 State of Food Security and Nutrition report. So I'm really pleased to be joined by very distinguished speakers and panelists today. Our two keynote speakers today are His Excellency Tom Kelly, UK Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the UN agencies in Rome. Ismahan El-Wafi, who's our FAO's first ever Chief Scientist. So welcome to the two keynote speakers. Really nice to have you with us. And our four panelists are His Excellency Tanawat Tenshin, who's the CFS chairperson, and the permanent representative of Thailand to the UN agencies in Rome. His Excellency Hans Hugevin, who's the co-chair of the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, GECSA. Philip Taunton, flagship leader, priorities and policies for climate smart agriculture, CCAFS. And Leah Wanamba Nais, senior policy officer, Directorate of Sustainable Environment and Blue Economy at the African Union Commission. So thank you all for joining us. Really pleasure to have you with us at this event today. And let me welcome again colleagues who are joining us at this event. It's nice to have you with us as well. So please join us in this discussion. Post your questions in the chat box, your comment, your views, anything you would like to share with us. But more importantly, any questions you have that you would like to ask the panelists, that would be with pleasure. So I'll keep an eye on the chat box. And for the speakers, If I try to stop you, please don't take it personally. So, because I want to keep to time and make sure everyone gets enough opportunity to speak. So welcome everyone again, and let's kick off, and let me invite with great pleasure Ismahan Al-Wafi to give her remarks. Ismahan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Zitouni. It's really a pleasure to be with you to really discuss how could we do better? How could we really get together for a good fight? So ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is really a pleasure for me to be with you today as we reflect on both the challenges and opportunities that come with the sustainable agri-food system transformation. So transformation, I think it's the word that we are hearing the most this year. And we need really to think about what are the challenges and what are the opportunities. The global intersecting emergencies of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and the COVID-19 crisis have increased risk and vulnerabilities of the agri-food system. The economic burdens of climatic and non-climatic disasters remains higher in low-income countries, particularly where poverty and dependency on agricultural livelihood render communities more vulnerable to the impact of such disaster and the loss of natural capital. Reducing hunger and poverty is key for improved disaster risk reduction and adaptive capacities. This in itself, it's a mammoth challenge. How could we really reduce hunger and poverty? And when we put it against the backdrop of broader and varied economic, environmental, social, political, and demographic change, the situation is grim. We see that hunger is in fact rising under a warming climate, and Zitouni just mentioned it. The recent estimates are telling us that we have 161 million more hungry and malnourished people within 1 year. So just between 2019 and 2020, we got 161 million more, whereas we are trying to reduce it and get to really zero hunger by 2030. As a result of health-related economic shutdowns, nearly 1 in every 3 people in the world did not have access to adequate food in 2020. And although it is not yet possible to fully account for the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is estimated that 22% of children under 5 of age suffered from stunting. We have about 7% that are suffering from wasting, and about 6%, again, of children under 5 that are overweight. So drivers that are external, such as conflict or climate shocks, or internal, like low productivity and inefficiency of food supply chain to the agri-food system, are both the external and the internal drivers are pushing up the cost of nutritious food, which combined with low income are increasingly making healthy food and the food that we would like people to eat and affordable, particularly again in countries that are affected by multiple drivers and countries within the category of least income countries. When we look at the gender gap, we see that also the gender gap in the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity has grown even larger in the year of the COVID-19 pandemic. So while we know that the 5 of the top global risks in terms of likelihood and impact, which are extreme weather condition, climate action failure, natural disaster, biodiversity loss, and human-made natural disaster, can all be linked to agri-food system. So all the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood and impact are related to the agri-food system. We also know that the co-benefit that come with transitioning to a more resilient and more biodiverse agri-food system can help us achieve our climate agenda, our biodiversity goal, and our development goals. So the same, there is the impact, the negative impact, but there is also the co-benefit if we transform our agri-food system to really align our goals and achieve them together. Ladies and gentlemen, system approach are needed to build coherent portfolios of policies, investment, and legislation, and enable win-win solution while managing trade-offs in our agri-food system. But first, in responding to the current crisis, we must prioritize social policy and reinforce a social protection floor with the base standard for society to meet. There is an urgent need to provide support for communities and individual capacity building to enable everyone, especially small-scale producers, to adapt and prosper in the transition to more resilient and more sustainable agri-food system. Supports include designing and implementing gender-sensitive social protection intervention, ensuring equitable access to productive resources, input and services, and putting in place financial services support mechanisms that target rural women economic activities as producers, as processors, as traders, and as entrepreneurs, among others. So while option will be context specific, the 6 pathways to follow towards agri-food system transformation were very clear in the FAO SOFI 2021 report. And I'm gonna cite them for you. The first one is integrating humanitarian development and peace building policies in conflict affected area. The second one is scaling up climate resilient across food system. The third one is strengthening the resilience of the most vulnerable to economic adversity. The fourth point is to intervening along the food supply chain to lower the cost of nutritious food. The fifth point is tackling poverty and structural inequalities, ensuring that interventions are pro-poor and are inclusive. And the last one is strengthening food environments and changing consumer behavior to promote positive dietary patterns with positive impacts on human health and on the environment. Ladies and gentlemen, FAO strategic framework that was just approved by a few months ago, 2022 to 2031, put at its center the vision of leaving no one behind through a more efficient, more inclusive, more resilient, and more sustainable agri-food system so that we can have a world with a better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life for all. Technology and innovation are 2 of the 4 accelerators in FAO strategic framework, together with data and complement, which include governance, human capital, and institutions. So this transformation will require an inclusive and gender-responsive approaches to digital skills development and access to innovative solutions that sustainably increase food productivity with less. So producing more with less while building resilience to climate change and while also protecting our natural resources. This need is made more pertinent when we consider that the digital divide continues to be an issue, in particular among population in a remote area who fall outside data collection processes. So almost half of the world population, 3.7 billion people, are currently offline, the majority of them women and people in developing countries. And that's where FAO is putting a lot of emphasis on hand-in-hand initiatives that aim to accelerate agricultural transformation and sustainable rural development based on data, based on information, with focusing mostly on the poorest countries. And the initiative is supported by a geospatial platform and a data lab for statistical innovation, which combine big data, artificial intelligence for decision-making. And within that, really, again, innovation, science, and data are very critical for both the hand-in-hand initiative, but also for many other new initiatives, such as the Green Cities Initiative, the 1,000 Digital Villages, as well the COVID-19 response and recovery program. Here, I would like to highlight that no institution can have it all. No institution, no country, no region has all the data, all the knowledge alone. We need partnership and collaboration with multiple stakeholders. For example, we are collaborating with Google and using EarthMap that's really to create a platform that is open, public, and accessible, and can also provide the member state with the ability to analyze the geospatial data and to link it with their programs, including hand-in-hand or other programs at the nation level. Climate smart agriculture, it's one of the key areas that we have to think about. because again, IPCC showed us that the changes are happening very rapidly, and under all scenarios, we will have really to build a new climate smart agriculture and agroecological approaches that really will allow us to do the transformation and produce more with less, basically. But increasing knowledge and awareness without addressing human behavior does not translate into long-term impact. We must re-examine our development efforts to ensure that our intervention and project truly consider how people make decisions and then build enabling conditions for sustainably enhancing behaviors. FAO is embracing behavioral science to support the transition to more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food system. Our recently created Office of Innovation will coordinate and strengthen behavioral science work internally and with other UN entities and organizations and member states. FAO is developing its first ever science and innovation strategy in tandem with the revamped FAO strategy on climate change. We are gearing up toward increasing our impact on the ground, widening our partnership with our stakeholders, and deepening synergies to scale up support on the ground. So I think collectively we can and must do more. Do more to place science firmly at the center of our decision and action, and we must drive stronger connection between the food system agenda, the climate agenda, and the biodiversity agenda, given the interdependencies of all these global agendas and global challenges. During today's event, where our distinguished speaker will share more practical examples on how innovative solutions can tackle the impact of climate change and transform our agri-food system. And I'm really looking forward to hear those ideas and debate. Thank you again to all the panelists and to all of you that joined us today. And I look forward to carrying this conversation through, as Zitouni said, to COP26 and beyond. Over to you, Zitouni.
Well, thank you so much, Ismahan, for touching on so many critical points there and setting the scene so nicely. Thank you for mentioning the need for addressing the co-benefit and having a system approach for win-win solutions. And also the point you highlighted about partnerships and collaborations and where the hand-in-hand fits in, as you said, to help the most vulnerable communities and countries through sharing of information and data. And the initiatives you mentioned, such as the Green Cities initiatives, also in the climate smart agriculture, and the importance of behavioral science. I think that's really an exciting area, because in the end, we need to reach out to consumers, to people, so they can understand how our choices actually do impact on our health and the health of the environment. So thanks very much for that. And let me now hand over to His Excellency Tom Kelly. Tom, over to you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. I'm having some tech problems. I'm going to switch off my video and I'll come back on at the end just to save bandwidth here. Mr. Chair, it's a real honor and a pure pleasure to co-host this event with you today. It's a great opportunity to link the recent UN Food Systems Summit to the upcoming COP26 summit in Glasgow. As the COP host country, I want to underline today that agriculture and food systems sit at the very heart of the UK's COP agenda. At COP, the UK will launch the Global Action Agenda on Transforming Agricultural Innovation at COP26. With the Global Action Agenda, we aim to set out a vision and a common goal to drive a just rural transition informed by the best evidence and innovation, with solutions tailored to the unique contexts and challenges that farmers face. Mr. Chair, a more resilient food and nutrition system calls for big increases in agricultural innovation and research. We want to use COP to focus international efforts on interventions that place agricultural livelihoods and nutrition outcomes at the very center of climate change discussions. We're underlining those connections today because those most at risk of malnutrition are also increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as droughts, flooding, land degradation. And Mr. Chair, I want to use the rest of the time I have available to focus on the role of innovation and investment. I've already seen some people in the chat box talking about financing and investment. And the UK government has been working with the Commission on Sustainable Intensification and CIGAR's CFS to firm up the evidence base for this work on investment. We've been taking part and helping to fund studies as part of our COP campaign on agricultural innovation. The climate shot that's referred to in the papers is responding to the clear investment gap that we face, and the UK continues to support this work with other partners to deliver against this global action agenda. Mr. Chair, these studies are showing that only about 7% of current annual innovation investment in agriculture, that's about 7% of $60 billion in the global south, explicitly targets environmental, social, and equity outcomes. Only 7%. These studies tell us that we need a real shift in how we invest in innovation. This means in identifying the greatest challenges for agriculture and nutrition. It means involving farmers and communities in developing solutions. It means focusing on scaling up the technologies that work. And it means linking finance to public and private sector partners that can move technologies from early stage research through to deployment. And Mr. Chair, with such a complicated set of issues to tackle, we need a really solid evidence base to guide priorities. I want to come back to that again, because with so many challenges, we need to know where to direct our funding. We've helped to support the Commission for Sustainable Agriculture Intensification Investment Gap Study, that's COASI, which considered the agricultural innovation investment landscape over the past 7 years, the past 10 years. And that's what that 7% figure comes from, Mr. Chair. We're just not spending enough of our money targeting these environmental, social, and equity outcomes. So we are going to use COP to look for ways to do better, to catalyze investment in innovation. That's because the farmers at the center of our food systems are often uniquely vulnerable to climate change, and yet they play a vital role in global food security. But yet, having said all that, less than 2% of climate finance supports solutions for smallholder farmers. The private sector, small and medium-based enterprises, social enterprises, they all play a key role in addressing these challenges, but they struggle to scale up. Levels of financing remain low, reflecting high costs and the risks of financing, whether real or perceived. And taking the solutions that work to scale will require significant investment and smarter and more innovative use of private and scarce public sector finance. Mr. Chair, I want to come back to COP to finish my comments today. The COP26 summit, the Food System Summit, and this CFS 49 discussion are enabling us to identify the key areas for action, to identify what the priorities are, to unlock the investment and the engagement and the collaboration that can transform food systems to deliver for people, nature, and climate. From the UK's perspective, what we need to do is to develop broader, stronger partnerships that bring donors, researchers, farmers, and businesses together. and we want to recognize the work that others are doing as well. We welcome the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate that is being supported by the US and the United Arab Emirates. This is an important initiative that's accelerating agricultural innovation in alignment with our campaign. And the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogue is another initiative which the UK is hosting and supporting. With its dedicated working group on research and innovation, which Brazil is leading, the FACT dialogue brings countries together to strengthen our research and innovation efforts to support sustainable productivity growth in agriculture and avoid expansion of unsustainable practices. And there are many other initiatives, Mr. Chair, such as the 100 million farmers multi-stakeholder platform, which is aiming to transition towards net zero, nature-positive food systems by 2030. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, this is a critical time to discuss the food, nutrition, and climate agendas together. That's what we are thinking about as we prepare to host COP next month. This event is a great opportunity to bring those agendas together. It's a really important discussion for us that you will see us picking up again at COP26 in our efforts to transform agricultural innovation systems for people, nature, and climate. Mr. Chair, thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. That was a great tour of some key points you made there with regard to the global action agenda for transforming agricultural innovation, and particularly the focus you put on scaling up technologies that work, and also the issues of investment in innovation. There's some striking figures you mentioned there, particularly the less than 2% of climate finance that supports solutions for smallholder farmers. There is a huge gap there to fill. So thanks very much for highlighting that. And the identification of key areas and actions that you mentioned, particularly between COP26 Food Systems Summit and CFS 49. And Ismahan has highlighted that as well, the need to join the dots between these, absolutely, and to make sure that the priorities are addressed in a synergistic way. And thank you for your emphasis on the need to develop stronger partnership for this, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So let me now invite our panelists, and if you could turn your cameras on so I can see you, thank you. I wonder if Leah is able to join us, but we will wait for her. She has some issues with access. And I'm pleased that Ismahan will join us in the discussion as well. And Tom, you're very welcome also to join. So I can see that there are a few questions already in chat. And I'm very pleased to also see that there are a number of students also joining us. So that's great. So they're putting comments and questions there. That's really good. So we have two sets of questions. I will bring each one of you at a time. And perhaps between the two, I'll have a look at what's on the chat and can vary and ask you some questions from the audience. And if at any time you would like to come in or elaborate on any other question, or you want to add anything, please just raise your hand to let me know, and that will be with pleasure. Just make this dynamic and informative so we can all learn from this. So let me first come to Ambassador Tanawat, since we're in the context of the CFS and the CFS voluntary guidelines, in particular on food systems and nutrition, that highlight the role of innovation in tackling climate change. Actually, innovation that plays a role to address both climate change and malnutrition. So, Ambassador, what do we need to do then to really effectively implement these guidelines?
Thank you very much, moderators, and also thank you for your invitation. Since I see other panelists who joined me in this discussion with our ICC, who is a former, who is the chair of Open-Ended Working Group and others. I think it's very, very interesting to see that once we have the guidelines, what we can do next. We always spend our times, our energies, and you remember this document when we have the HLPE report number 12 on nutrition and food securities, and we gone through the whole process of policy convergence to have the voluntary guideline on food system and nutrition, or even though the policy recommendation on agroecological and other innovative approach. Once we finish, once the CFS plenaries endorse the voluntary guidelines, the big question mark that we need to answer together, what we can do more and what we can bring the voluntary guidelines, the policy recommendation, or the global policies that produced by CFS to be implemented at the country level. We need champion. We need ownerships of the member countries with other stakeholders at the country level. Because the voluntary guideline give us just a broad ideas. But when you look at the details, the countries need to develop the national policies, the national programs, project, and undertakes action aiming to transform their food system to deliver healthy diets, improve nutrition, to protect the biodiversity and environment. And that's why it will come up with the series of the national program, national project. But anyway, we know that the countries have different priorities. And also sometimes they cannot address all. And that's why once the country know what's their priorities, and they really focus what the issue that they want to develop. And that's why it will come up with the national program and project to be implemented to make an impact at the local level. But sometimes we also need private sectors, not sometimes we need private sectors. We need civil society, even those consumers, to echo their voice, to tell the government that this one is really their need. And that's why I really sure that after we finish the CFS 49, FAO, IFAD, WFP, and other UN agencies will help us, will join their synergies and investment to support the members to create the global programs in transforming the food system using the CFS policy products and implement at the country level. And after that, we will see a real outcome and impact on ground. Thank you very much.
That's very encouraging. Thank you very much for that clarity. Let me now bring in Philip and from CCAFS. And I think it's important, Philip, a number of colleagues already mentioned, a strong evidence base and looking at the linkages between climate change and malnutrition. So what does the evidence base really on these linkages look like? What are the key gaps in knowledge that we have?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And please let me just say I'm very pleased and honoured to be invited to be a part of this event. The interlinkages between climate change and malnutrition. Let me start by saying the evidence base is large and it's expanding quite rapidly. Although I should say a lot of the previous work on these linkages between climate change and malnutrition has tended to focus more on yields and production. And there are obvious problems with that. We all know even if more food is available, even at the level of a household, it may not translate necessarily into positive outcomes on nutrition and food security. Another is, of course, not all farmers and households are the same. And there are many factors that can affect people's ability to access and utilize food. And we know that also changes through time, for example, through droughts or food spikes and so on. So I think to start, it's crucial to take a food systems approach. And I think Ismahan already mentioned the importance of a systems approach. So considering all the actors, from input suppliers to producers to post-farm processing, all the way to the consumers. And of course, we know that there are many intervention points along this chain, if you like, and many places also where climate change can affect nutritional outcomes, both directly and indirectly. And it seems to be that the more we understand about the effects, the impacts of climate change, then in many respects, the worse they seem to become. So we know that nutrient-dense crops are very susceptible to climate change, for example. Increased food safety issues are likely to arise. A warmer, wetter world is more likely to be a sicker world, given that the distributions of vector-borne and food-borne diseases and microorganisms are likely to change, and maybe drastically in some places. Increasing levels of carbon dioxide affecting the nutrient density of some key crops. This is relatively new information. And so in many ways, although the evidence base there's a good basis for this and it's expanding, there's still many gaps that we need to fill. I think in general terms, we could think around what really are the potential adaptation and mitigation strategies. What are their outcomes on nutrition? What are the impacts and the impact pathways of climate smart agricultural interventions, for example? So in attempting to meet these three pillars of enhanced food security as a basis based on productivity, resilience, and mitigation, what are the effects of different safety nets, different risk reduction programs, for example? What are the impacts of climate on nutritional outcomes of different target populations? So this is not only between women and men or adults and young people, but between the rural and rural and urban populations, for example. And in terms of trying to come up with priorities, where are the hotspots of climate change and malnutrition, where these interact in particular ways, both over the shorter term and in the longer term? And where are these? Where are they likely to get worse in the future, given what we know are going to be some level of unavoidable climate change in the coming decades? And with this kind of information, then we can very much target interventions in a more efficient and effective way. So just to really, a few things that can help, I believe, reiterate this idea of a food systems approach. This is crucial. And then multidisciplinary teams and coordination between different sectors: agriculture for development, the health community, disaster risk reduction. For example, we all have lessons that can be learned from each other. And so partnerships to try to overcome what may be some institutional constraints in terms of working together to be really effective. I think also things such as paying much more explicit attention to equity concerns. I think these are key. So notions around fairness, justice, and inclusion, because these are all things that can affect underlying nutrition drivers. Okay. And then perhaps just finally to say strategies to deal effectively with food safety challenges, particularly given the role of informal markets in many tropical, subtropical countries, and what are the health and economic burdens of food safety issues, for example. So in summary, we have an evidence base, it's growing through time, but there are still many gaps. And I think we need to fill some of these gaps if we're really to be super effective in targeting interventions in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So the key message is we still have a strong evidence base, but there's still many gaps there. Let me just give a heads up to Tom in particular. There is a question there for Tom. I'll bring you in a minute. It says, how can the outcomes from COP26 on agricultural innovation be taken up by CFS in the future? Tom and Ambassador Tanawat as well, you're welcome to come and answer that question as well. So this is just a heads up, but let me first bring in His Excellency Hans Hoogeveen. Hans, this is quite exciting time really for climate smart agriculture, since we're looking for the solutions, and you heard that we still have gaps in the evidence as well. And since you've been so involved and as a co-chair of GACSA, working directly with countries and farmers. I just want to ask you, how does GACSA then seek to support these linkages you heard of between climate smart agriculture and the nutrition sensitive agriculture?
Thank you very much, Situri, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I think GACSA, the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, was launched in 2014. And it was launched to break down the silos between, on the one hand, sustainable agriculture, and the other hand, fighting climate change. And I think the concept of climate smart agriculture, which arose from the launch of the Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, is now a well-known concept. But we have to do much more because the facts are against us. 800 million, more than 800 million people in hunger. 2 million people cannot access safe and affordable food, and 1.6 billion people with obesity. So we need to do more. And what we have to bring together now is, I would say, climate change, nutrition, and sustainable agriculture. And I think we have a huge momentum because we have had the Food System Summit. And for the first time, I think in decades, food systems and nutrition are put on the highest level and the highest international agenda in the UN. Heads of states, heads of agencies, CEOs, heads of international organizations, NGOs are discussing now how to approach a more sustainable food systems and nutrition. But let's not forget that in the heart of our food systems and the beginning of our food system, what was said also by Tom, are our farmers. Small scale farmers, big farmers. They are the beginning of our food systems. And if we want to have transformative change, we have to approach the farmers. We have to bring them in a position that they can grow in a climate smart way. But that means that we have to give them access to affordable, accessible, and implementable innovations and technologies. And that's easy as that done. Because we can say it at the global level, but at the end of the day, we have to go to the national level. And that means that we have to make a national picture to see how can we reach out to the farmers. And there, the Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture is playing a role as a platform to bring farmers, investors, and science together. But it has to be done at the national scale. Of course, when we speak about innovation technologies, it's not only new technologies, it is also indigenous and traditional technologies, because they have shown that they can do a lot for nutrition, a lot for climate, and a lot for sustainability. And I'm always looking to the bright side, of the optimistic side of life, because we see examples where things are going in the right direction. First of all, as was said by Tanat, we have voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. We negotiated them, it's now to implement them. And that's the hardest way, because we had during the CFS week, an excellent session about how to implement them. But we need to implement them. It's not that we say we like them, we are going to implement. No, we have to start implementing them. And that's an obligation, not only for governments, but also for the private sector, NGOs, and civil society. Only then we can make a step forward to support the farmers. What we also see now is, for example, that when we speak about financing, that more and more private sector companies, as well as civil society organizations, stand ready to invest in transforming those food systems. And for example, the Champions 12.3, together with the World Bank and FDR, developing a global food loss facility to support investments of the private sector to overcome our food losses. We are losing 1/3 of our production every year. So think what we can do if we can maintain it. Indeed, it was one of the questions which I saw, which was we have to think about the carbon credit system for farmers. The idea was tabled at the pre-summit, the pre-food system summit. And now behind the scenes, some parties and stakeholders are starting to see whether or not we can develop it. I think that are the challenges which we face, but we have to start with our farmers in GACSA, which providing the platform. We go now in the second phase to bring transformative change of food systems with the farmers, make sure that they produce nutritious food, but make also sure that we give them the possibility and also the financial steps to do so. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks really for emphasizing. And it's good to hear this really more, that everything we do has to reach farmers, and it's good to have that focus really very clear, and to facilitate the access to innovation and to involve investors, because you can only deploy innovation and technological innovation if there is obviously enough investment for that. And thank you for highlighting the fact that this is not just about technology, but initiatives and knowledge as well. And your last important point on carbon credit systems for farmers, that's increasingly happening, and even in the context of COP26, particularly on Article 6 on carbon markets, it's something that is coming up. It's something that is going to affect private sectors and will be an opportunity for farmers. Thanks very much for that. So before I ask the question to Tom and Ambassador Tanawat, let me just give a heads up also to Ismahan. There is a question there perhaps you may want to take. In your opinion, how can we make a real transformation change in our food systems in developing countries? So you may want to give some thought to this. There's so many questions actually in the chat, so feel free to pick up any and answer that. And I hear that Leah hopefully will be able to join us in about 5 minutes. If she does, yeah, please let me know so I can bring her in the discussion as well. So Tom, over to you on the question on how can the outcomes from COP26 on agricultural innovation be taken up by CFS in the future?
Well, Chair, that's a great question. It's a big question, and I would answer that by stressing 3 things. I want to go back to what I said in my comments at the beginning, that we are trying in COP this year as the COP chair to bring all these themes together. So we have these discussions this week on the CFS. They've been really good. I'll come back to that at the end as to why that really fits with our agenda. We've got the UN Food Systems Summit. We've got COP. We had the G20 Agricultural Ministers meeting this year as well, last month up in Florence. And what we're trying to do is take all these issues, not forget about them, integrate them into our climate change planning. So the first point is the CFS discussions have been very useful and important for us. Second thing is, in terms of what CFS can do after COP, CFS isn't an implementer, right? It's a mechanism to bring people together so that we can have a broader view of interests and a broader idea of priorities. And I think the important thing that CFS can do after COP for us is making sure that we're listening to the right people. So sometimes these discussions are a dialogue amongst ourselves. CFS has done a great job in bringing a broader platform together of the private sector, civil society, governments. And to go back, I'm not going to repeat my speech statistics, but there's a big problem when only 2% of climate finance is getting to the small scale farmer. So I think the answer to the question is CFS can really be a very useful platform for those voices, so that when governments and the private sector come, once we have tried to build up the case for more finance, where does it go? Where are the priorities? Because once you have built up the case, there's a huge number of potential ways to spend the money. So CFS plays an important role in broadening that partnership, making sure that farmers' voices are heard, and that's what we're trying to do in COP. I can say a bit more about some of the climate short issues, but someone has already helpfully put the link up in the chat box. So the climate short gives more information on what we're doing, but it's the platform that CFS provides. I think that's really important. Getting the voice of the small scale farmer in these discussions, so that when it comes to country investments, which is where it matters, we're hearing from the right people.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's very helpful. Let me bring in Ambassador Tanawat as well, from your perspective, Ambassador for CFS. So how can the outcomes from COP26 on agricultural innovation be taken up by CFS in the future?
Yep. Actually, I just would like to take some points that Tom just mentioned earlier, how we can use the CFS platform to discuss in such a complex issues with such a complex food system, such a complex of multi-stakeholders. Because the CFS has been designed to use inclusive and multi-stakeholders approach to discuss the food securities and nutrition related issues. And that's why once we're going to use this approach, I'm sure that the CFS is ready to use its platform to address the support for innovations that delivers on other issues, including biodiversity, climate change, and environment. And even though when I look at some question raised by our participants, and one of the issues that they're asking about how to keep balance between plants and animals, because I know that in our food system everything is connected to everything, and that's why in this case, such a complex situations, we also can use these types of multi-stakeholder platform to discuss the difficult, the complex issues, to make sure that we can have such a kind of new ideas, innovative ideas, how to solve the issues is such a complex, like food system or any other issues. And that's why we now to look at our CFS as an opportunity, and also we can bring CFS multi-stakeholders and inclusive platform to the country level. Because I can give you an example. In Thailand, we have the CFS national committees, and we also have the platform to bring private sector, civil society, NGO, farmer organization, producer organization to discuss such issues that are very complex. And that's why we can use these module, these modalities, and bring it to the country level to have such a kind of a CFS national platform, and also work with multi-stakeholder to discuss with several issues that have a complexities. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for highlighting the interconnectedness between these issues, and goes back to what Ismahan was saying about joining the dots. I think all these big events happening, including the CFS, of course, and it's really time to join those dots and make things happen on the ground in a synergistic way. And COP26 has campaigns on nature, on resilience, and obviously priority to finance and collaboration, but they have to come together to address these joint efforts. So thanks very much for highlighting that. It's really important. There's so many questions actually on the chat, and it's really good to see that it's very active. So colleagues, feel free to respond to those directly or provide links. So that's really helpful. So let me now bring in Ismahan. Ismahan, there was a question there on your opinion. How can we make a real transformational change in our food systems in developing countries? So over to you, Ismahan.
Thank you, Zitouni, and thank you for the question. I think there is a huge opportunities in the South to really upgrade the efficiency of the agri-food system at large. And I think the way we need to do it is by adopting more science and technology and innovation. Unfortunately, we are not seeing the same level of adoption in most of the South. I wouldn't say all of them, but most of the South countries, the developing world, for technology per se, even technologies that were created 20 years ago. And we have to understand why. And I know that the affordability of technology and innovation and know-how, it's still outside the capacity of smallholder farmers in the developing world. So we have to pay attention to the affordability of the innovation. Could we reduce it? Could we make it much more accessible? Could we make it manufactured and processed within the country to reduce the cost as well? So WTO report shows that most of the commodities goes around across the border at least twice. So you might be sending it as a raw product from the developing world and getting it back processed with 20 times and 50 times sometimes and 100 times the price. So we have to look at those efficiencies, analyze them, and see where we have wins. The other component, I was just in another side event by the CFS Secretariat, and Rob Voss from IFPRI gave us numbers on the subsidies for the agri-food system at large and food production at large. And the number shows that there is about $720 billion per year in support for farmers and food production worldwide. I asked the question to Rob, what is it? Is it mostly North? Is it mostly South? And it turns out that more than 60% of it's in the developing world. And those, unfortunately, that $720 billion as incentives or as subsidies and support, only 3% of it, it's for agriculture innovation and knowledge systems. So you could see right there a huge opportunity really to increase the support for innovation, the support for solutions that can tick all the boxes again, that can tick the box of increasing efficiency, but also protecting climate and protecting the biodiversity. I could give an example from Morocco on drip irrigation. Morocco went very, very large on drip irrigation under the Green Plan, and they moved from very low percentage on drip irrigation in terms of irrigation, I think below 20% to 90%. And that was done through subsidies and through support to the farmers. So when you are investing, let's see, in an irrigation methodology that is much more efficient, you are increasing the productivity because you are providing irrigation or supplementary irrigation to certain ecosystem that needs it, but in the same time, you are reducing the water footprint. So I think in the South, we need again to align incentives. We have to align incentives, and we have to bring in innovation at a cost that farmers can afford. And we have really to pay attention to the livelihood and the decency of the life of the farmers. So we have to increase the income of the farmers, and there are different ways and means to do that as well. And again, try to cover as much of the value chain within the borders as much as possible. Over to you, Zituni.
Thanks very much, Smahan, for explaining the challenges of affordability and access. And it's good you mentioned the example of the drip irrigation in farms in Morocco and how that helped to increase productivity. And your last point on incentives, there is also a question here that says, well, how do governments incentivize farmers to bring in new technologies and innovations at their farms? So I'll come back to this question to all the panelists or anyone who would like to take them. That would be really helpful because I'm keeping an eye on other questions as well. And if you can be quick in your answers, we can bring in more questions from the audience because they're really very, very important. So you mentioned innovation, Ismahan, and I want to come back to Philip and ask you, Philip, particularly, we're talking about solutions and what are the innovations actually that are out there? See, Ismahan mentioned the drip irrigation, for instance, but what are the innovations out there that can actually help deliver this twin wins for climate change and nutrition?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there are a very large number of promising innovations in the pipeline, but I think it's also, we need to recognize that there is a massive, you could call it like a back catalogue of interventions that have been, in many cases, very well tested over decades. And I think we really need to make a much better use, more effective and efficient use of the back catalogue of research that's already been done and is out there and is available for smallholder farmers to adopt. given appropriate incentives and pathways for uptake. Having said that, there's also a lot in the pipeline along the whole length of the agri-food value chain, from as before, from primary production through to consumption and waste management. I mean, just a couple of very quick examples. What's been called next generation seasonal forecasts in agriculture. So for smallholder farmers, if they can receive on mobile phones or via radio, then seasonal forecasts about how good or not so good the coming season can be, is likely to be, then this can then help farmers to make the decision about investing more in perhaps slightly more intensive, little bit more fertilizer, for example, to make the best use that they can of the growing season conditions. There's things, I think there's a lot that could be done around local food production. So it could be vertical agriculture, but then it could be sort of things of much huge potential. Urban food gardens, for example, floating gardens, where there's a lot of local indigenous knowledge that has gone into these things, and they could be upscaled massively. Just by the by, even the city where I live in the UK over the last 18 months or so, there's been a massive growth in small urban food production plots. And I think this has lots of potential. There's new processing techniques for low energy processing technologies that can also help, for example, in reducing moisture content, increasing shelf life, and increasing the safety of foods. And could also mention things around biofortification of staple crops, and a lot of work around alternative proteins based on microbial or cellular alternatives to traditional foods. But I think the basic lesson here would be there are no silver bullets. Local context is so important that we really need to sort of make use of the full arsenal of what's new innovations, and already what's out there. And I think we also need to make bundles, so it's not just around the technical interventions, but as already been mentioned, it's about the policy and regulatory frameworks that may be needed, the finance for innovation startups, microcredit to enable smallholders to be able to adopt some of these things, developing the marketing incentives, and particularly capacity development with respect to some of these technologies that may be new for some smallholder farmers. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Phillips. And it's good you mentioned the issue of urban farming. I think maybe there will be some questions or points about that. I think Ismahan, you wanted to come back to the point you made earlier.
Absolutely. So maybe in terms of technologies, we have so many technologies, and really what we need to keep in mind, there is no silver bullet. It's really a diversification of our food system, diversification of our production system, diversification of actors. And I think that's very important. We need to bring in youth. We have a huge issue of unemployment in the developing world. We need to bring them in. And I see innovation and science and technology very good way to bring them in. So in most of these countries, we have really a broken system. Like I remember when you work in many countries, you hardly find seeds. So there is a lot of smuggling of seeds because people cannot access good varieties and well-treated seeds that will increase their germination and their productivity. So there is a lot of areas along the value chain or the food system that could be enhanced through technology, through innovation. Many of them, Philip, cite them, but there are a large number. But I think really, for me, it's bringing back the importance of agriculture as a pillar of well-being, not only as a pillar of economy. Maybe in the GDP, it's not a high number, but in well-being of people and in health, particularly of our environment and of the population, it's very important. And bringing back interest of youth in agriculture and provide them with the opportunities to develop SMEs around it. So when we talk about affordability, I always give an example of how, as a student myself, I was paying a different price for different for the same enzyme. It's TAC enzyme. I was in Syria, I used to pay $3,000 for it. When I'm in Spain, in my university, I paid $300 for it. And when I was at Cornell as a visiting student, $0. It doesn't make sense. So we have really to review the numbers. We have to face and have those data and understand how innovation and technology, be it for a young researcher or be it for a small farmers, is costing more in the south than in the north. And then when it comes to the productivity and the price, so we find the farmers by the end have the lowest wages, the lowest income, and the lowest opportunities. And that doesn't make sense. And that's where I see science and innovation very much needed, particularly for the developing world.
Thanks for explaining that. That's really helpful. Before I bring in Hans, I can see in the comment is really interesting. A colleague from Uganda who's saying that in Uganda, only 7% of land is owned by women. And yet most of the agricultural work is done by women. And she's highlighting, the importance of diversifying crops, not just for carbon sequestration, but also for health. So it's really an important point that, reflects the reality of smallholder farmers, particularly women. So if anyone wanted to comment on that, that would be really helpful. But let me, before I bring in Hans, also just remind all the panelists, the question that was asked, how do government incentivize farmers to bring in new technologies and innovation to farmers? And there was also a similar question that asked, well, farmers are often barely making a living. How do we make new technology and innovation affordable to them? I think as Ismahan touched on that, but if any other speakers want to come and add something, that would be really helpful. Hans, you heard that there is a lot of innovation there, but actually what's missing is scaling them up. So to take this innovation to scale, I guess, the multi-stakeholder partnership that the GACSA really facilitates are absolutely key. So can you just share with us what is GACSA doing to foster these kind of partnerships and what more needs to be done from what you heard?
Thank you very much, Situni, and thank you for the questions. I think it's very important that we try to match question and demand. When it comes to innovation and technologies, I think, of course, I should listen to them, as everybody is supporting that we have to make innovation technologies available to smallholder farmers and other farmers. And it's easier said to be done. And I think there we can use the example which the World Bank did for food losses. They made country profiles and mapped the problems in the food chain or the food system where the biggest losses in the commodities are. I think that kind of approach can be taken as well for, I would say, for the innovations. And I do hope that Ismahan, with the policy, the strategy on innovation and technology of FVO will go into that. Because I think we have to focus on the needs, and the needs are different from region to region. So we need a more regional approach. And from the region, we have to go to country. And I think what governments can do, and there are now initiatives taken by some universities together with private sector, is to build innovation or technology hubs in the countries, to sit together with government, local universities or national universities and research centers, together with international, to see where these are for which commodities at the farm level. That's also what the regional, where the GACSA comes in, is see how we can support it via regional analysis to match those needs of farmers and to see, can we find investors? Because it is interesting, I would say it is interesting for investors, because make sure that those farmers get access to those technologies, it means that the production will go higher, the returns, and then you will further develop your economy. But you have to start to make sure that farmers not only get the technologies, but are also trained, because not only give them a technology, they should be trained in using those technologies. And I saw one of the questions I also saw about subsidies. Indeed, we see quite some disturbing facts when it comes to subsidies. Because if we can make sure that the farmers get access to better technologies. They can increase their production, but they have to also have market access. And we have to make sure that we give that access to those farmers who produce much more at the regional and national scale. It's also much better for the environment and for climate change. But we have to do something about the subsidies as well, because that distortion is hindering, I would say, progress in a sustainable food chain, trying to transform our food systems. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much. Thanks for highlighting the importance of training farmers in the use of technology, because we often talk about transfer of technology and innovation, but that's not enough unless there is enough knowledge, of course, to use them and maintain them. And this is one of the biggest challenges in developing countries, when we make technology available without actually training and follow-up. So that's really an important point. I'll bring you in, Tom, in a minute if you want to take some of the questions I mentioned earlier, but let me bring in Ambassador Tanawat. The recent Food System Summit also really acknowledged the importance and the added value of the CFS and the key role of the CFS. So I just want to ask you, and the Food System Summit did actually highlight the role of innovation again, through the fact that innovation is a lever, as well as different coalitions that were coming out of that. But how does the CFS then seek to advance some of these efforts that were highlighted through the Food System Summit?
Yep. Thank you very much. And if you remember, just in June this year, the policy recommendation on agroecological and other innovative approaches were endorsed at the CFS 48 special sessions. And that's why we can say that, as several speakers already mentioned, when you're talking about innovation, knowledge, technologies, we can use the CFS as a platform for knowledge sharings, lesson learned, and also share new ideas, innovative ideas among the members, how they are implementing or to improve their agri-food system at the country level, at the local level. And that's why those knowledge innovations can be discussed at the CFS platform, and also to chase our new idea. And one of the issues that I just would like to share with you, when you're talking about the investment of the government on technologies and innovations, don't forget to bring in private sectors, because we know that now private sectors have a lot of knowledge and also technologies and innovation that we can work with them. But in the meantime, we also have to acknowledge the local knowledge, local technologies, local innovations by small farmers, or the group of farmers, or young smart farmers, that they have new ideas. And even though sometimes, as you mentioned about the affordable technology, affordable innovations, that among the farmers themselves, they can learn from each other. And the way that farmers learn from one farmer to another farmer is much, let's say, is easy. Because sometimes when you bring technicians or someone from the capitals, sometimes the language that farmers use and the language that the government use is different. And that's why in terms of the technologies transfer among the farmers, between the farmers, farmer field school is very, very important. And also, and that's why in terms of using CFS platform to share the knowledge, innovations and technologies among the members, private sectors, or even though farmers, is very important. Bring the local knowledge to the global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's such an important point that you really mentioned about learning, because not many people realize that actually, but farmers do actually prefer to learn from each other. And I will bring in Ismahan after Tom, come back to the point about behavioral science. How do we make then science available to people, including farmers, that can actually help them to adopt best practices and influence the behavior that leads to sustainability. So I'm glad you mentioned that point, because it's so critical if we don't get consumer behavior change and information that is useful for farmers. So Tom, let me bring you in on the questions I mentioned earlier, or any other point you would like to take. There was a question about how do governments incentivize farmers to bring in new technologies and innovations to their farms. I think there is a lot, at least in the UK, happening with public money for public good, and a lot of renewable energy, particularly happening at farm level. But perhaps you want to share with us some of the incentives that are being made available to farmers. Over to you.
Well, Zitouni, you are asking some very big questions, and I know that the clock is ticking, but I will say three things. I mean, I think I want to go back to a point that I'll come back to your subsidies point in a minute, but I want to go back to a point that the UK government's always, I think, having spent 25 years working for the UK government in development, we've always been very focused on, and that is, what does the evidence tell us? I think Ismahan made an important point about subsidies and the fact that anything that we're doing in terms of innovation has to be affordable to the people that need it. So my first answer to your question is, what does the evidence base say? And let's be guided by that. And we're trying to do that with COP. We've had a long history in the UK of being focused on evidence, and we want to make sure, in answering your question, that we're guided by the data. The second thing is the role of subsidies. You're right. The UK government is moving away from, since we're outside the EU, we're looking at subsidies in a different way. And we're looking at how we use subsidies to do agriculture in a different way, investing in nature-based solutions, looking at how subsidies can promote biodiversity outcomes, rather than just being a stimulus for aggregate production. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from that approach in the UK, and where relevant, link it to this discussion. I think the third thing, coming back to the CFS, I wanted to underline this point about partnerships. And I've been, as this really interesting session has been conducted, I've been watching the comments that are coming in on the chat bar. And there's one or two people that are using this chat very well, and I want to thank them for that. People clearly working with farmers in the field, complaining about how farmers cannot compete with the huge agricultural lobby and money that goes into agricultural subsidies in ways that are not always productive for the small scale farmer. And my last point, Mr. Chair, is that the more we can listen from the field, the more we can get these viewpoints, informing these discussions, strengthening the evidence base, then the better our discussions will be. So it's just to say thank you for the people that are making constructive comments in the chat bar, because I have been reading them, and combined with some points from the other panelists about making sure that when we recognize that more subsidies has to go into innovation that helps small scale farmers, that Ismahan was saying, it needs to be affordable, whatever comes out the other end. That's really important for us to take away, and that's all part of the evidence base. So that would be my response to your question.
Thank you very much, and you're right to get information from the field, actually, and I'm also pleased to see such an active conversation in the chat. There is so much information there and questions. There was one point from Abiodon, who's saying we must eat what we buy and buy what we eat. I like that. And this is a reference to food loss and waste. And this brings me nicely to bringing in Ismahan on behavioral science. But before I do that, just warn everyone that we have 5 minutes left. So what I would like to do after Ismahan is come back to each of the panelists and just give one key message you want to leave everyone with. that will help me summarize? It could be just one word, but just one key point you want to convey to everyone. So I'll come back to you one by one. Smahan, over to you.
So maybe Zitouni, before I get to behavioral science and the importance of behavioral science, I want to just agree with all panelists that really what we need is a system thinking. So now finally this year we are talking not only food security, not only ending poverty and malnutrition, but also climate change, also biodiversity. We're not only talking between us within the agriculture ministries and agriculture professionals, but we are talking about the system, including transport, including health, including energy. So I think we have a golden opportunity to do it this year. And for me, when we talk about technology and innovation, they don't work alone in silo. If you don't have the right policies, the right incentives, if you don't engage the private sector, it just fades away. And I think really that's what we are learning from the evidence, as Tom was saying, is that really we need to leave space for the private sector when there is a private sector. So you need, in the developing world, we need to develop that private sector with our youth, with our women, and provide them with the financial system and the inducive framework, policy framework to work. That's really what also Hans was getting to. It's a system really thinking and intervention. And on the human, by the art, we are humans. So we could learn. If we're not convinced, we wouldn't do it. And farmers are really, if there is something that is close to their heart, it's really their traditional knowledge and their freedom and freedom of decision. And that's where last week we had the World Food Forum and we had a research innovation. And I was very happy that a young scientist from Jordan actually won the prize. And her research was how you get farmers in Jordan to reduce their water footprint through know-how and through knowledge, not through technology. And that was really nice. And she showed with the research that actually they got much more saving through behavioral science and particularly access to information, access to knowledge than through technology. I remember another project that we have although in Jordan that talk about market pull. How could you let farmers buy the technology, but you make it affordable? You can't make it like completely out of their reach, but you let really the information, let them invest in it. You could do it by providing maybe certain loans or different ways of doing it on the financial side, but let them really get it at the price that they can afford it, of course, and let them do the change and lead that change. Over to you, Zitouni.
Great. Well, thanks very much. There's so many issues to talk about, actually. I think we already touched so many important points, and we're coming to the conclusion now. So I'd like to go around and just one key message or points from everyone. Let me start with you, Philippe.
Thanks. I would say maybe echoing what my colleague Danush has been putting in the chat box once or twice. It seems clear that if we're going to reach our goals in terms of transforming the food system, then we have to close this innovation gap, we can call it. So we need methods of producing food that protect nature and that protect livelihoods and human health. And to do that, we need to take a systems approach, and we need to do systemic innovation. We've been hearing about the issues of subsidies, and we need to try to do what we can to sort of break down some of these distortions. And if we're really going to,
Philippe, just one thing. So it's the innovation gap I take from you, right?
Sorry, yeah.
One thing. There's so many things there.
There are so many things.
I know. Just one, please. Innovation gap, right?
Yeah, we need to close through all means necessary.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, Ambassador Tanawat.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very brief. We have the global policy products. CFS products are available, but now we need your action on the ground to create the impact at the country level, regional, and global level. Thank you very much.
Action on the ground. Thank you very much. Ambassador Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. I would say my answer to that question is to go back to the first point I made in my speech as the COP chair this year, making sure that when we're talking about climate change, that agriculture and the small scale farmer is at the very center of that discussion. That would be my answer.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Hogeven?
Thank you very much. My message would be break down the silos between agriculture, climate change, and nutrition, and bring the farmers again in the middle of those policies, and make sure that they are not only in the middle, but they will get what they need to be the agents of change. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ismail.
And from my side, really, it's about diversification of everything. So nature is full of diversity. We need to have our agri-food system diversified in terms of everything, actors, productivity, systems, markets, everything. So diversification will be the key word that I want to really leave you with.
Great, thank you. And for me is to make innovation really successful and accessible to farmers, it needs to be accompanied with training and knowledge, and not just hard technology like that. So thank you very much. There was so many points, as I said, there was lots in the chat, really good. So I hope that you found this useful and learned something with us together. And I hope that you found it dynamic and active. So thanks very much for staying with us until the end. Thanks very much for joining us. And thanks to all the panelists and the speakers, and also to all colleagues behind the scene who really made this possible in organizing the event, putting all the logistics together, particularly Danush, Lily, Jenna, Sabrina, and apologies if I forgot anyone, but the team was excellent, and thank you for the excellent organization. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.